I am very honored to introduce our featured speaker tonight. On a personal level, it has really been a pleasure to get to know and work with Frank Bracken during the 19 months that I have been at Ball State. Frank has led a very interesting life, and his connections to the community and to the university are deep and personal. Frank's grandfather, Frank C. Ball, was the Ball brother who rallied the other four brothers to buy a bankrupt college and give it to the state for the formation of the Ball State Teachers College. Frank's father, Alexander Bracken, served on our Board of Trustees for 22 years, 20 of those as chair of the board. In 1980, Frank succeeded his own father as a member of our Board of Trustees, carrying on the family tradition of board service at Ball State. And Frank chaired the search committee that led to my appointment as the 14th president of Ball State. Frank commands our admiration based on his history of corporate, civic, and public leadership. He is an attorney who spent 3 years as the legislative counsel for the U.S. Department of Interior from 1969 to 72, when the Department of Interior was led by Wally Hickel. Then he returned to Muncie for the next 16 years and served in a variety of capacities at Ball Corporation, and then became chairman of the board of directors of Ball Incon Glass Packaging Corporation. All the while, he gave generously of his time to corporate, foundation, and educational boards. In 1989, he returned to Washington and served 4 years as the Deputy Secretary of the Interior for the first President Bush, Bush 41. During that time, Frank was instrumental in the formation of the Civil War Trust, which later merged with the Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites to create the Civil War Preservation Trust. That means we will be hearing tonight from a leader in the preservation of Civil War battlefields, not just an interested bystander. I know the topic of battlefield preservation is close to Frank's heart, and not just because he loves history or because he has dedicated so much energy to battlefield preservation, but because, as I imagine he may tell you, his family history includes fascinating stories from the Civil War. And that is something that he shares in common with my husband, Roy Budd, who also can trace his family lineage back to the Civil War. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, the Vice President of the Ball State University Board of Trustees, Mr. Frank Bracken.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne. I'm happy to be here. I honestly think of all the things I've been involved in and the things I've done, the most successful was chairing the search committee that found you as president of Ball State University. I think that was absolutely a terrific choice. Well, back to what I'm here for, talk about battlefield preservation. I've always been interested in historic things. I think I always remember a comment somebody made to me, and somebody out here will know probably whose comment this was. But they said that people who have no regard for their past will do little worth remembering in the future. Now, if you think about that, I think that's very appropriate. And I have always been interested in the past. Whether I do much that will be remembered in the future is yet to come, obviously. But the past has always fascinated me. I've had all my life the saber and the pistol and what you call the accoutrements, the hardware of my great-grandfather Bracken, whose pictures are there. His uniform wouldn't fit me even if it had survived. You can see he's smaller than me. But these cloth uniforms, this uniform I have was made by one of the very good outfits that make the reenactors uniforms for the very dedicated reenactors that go out and perform the battles and are in the movies and all that kind of thing. So everything I've got is authentic. but the cloth is not original from the war itself. The pistol holsters are original, and the cloth or the leather bag is original. But as Joanne said, I was the Deputy Secretary in the Department of the Interior, which is a very operative agency. We do have some regulatory responsibility on oil and gas and saline water and all that kind of thing, but it's basically operating things. And one of the things that was very concerning to Manuel Lujan, who was secretary from New Mexico, Interior usually has a Western person as secretary, since it's fairly Western oriented, although it's becoming more Eastern now. But the thing that we were facing at the time was a developer that was going to destroy, literally destroy through a development, the battlefield at 2nd Bull Run. Now, let me just back up a little bit. The Confederates usually called the battlefields in their armies by physical locations, and the Federals called them by rivers. So we call the Battle of Manassas the Battle of Bull Run. They call it the Battle of Manassas. Their army was the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Tennessee. The Union was the Army of the Potomac, and the Army of the Tennessee River, and so on. But anyway, this developer was, he had options, and he was going to develop all kinds of shopping malls and condos and that kind of thing down at Bull Run, 2nd Bull Run. And Manuel Lujan and I thought, well, we got to try to do something about this. And so we got a fellow who Roy has met with me on the battlefield named Ed Bars, who is one of a kind. So Ed came up and he went through all this with Manuel Lujan and me as to what happened at Bull Run and how this was going to destroy the battlefield and so on. As a result of that, we were able to salvage the Bull Run battle, 2nd Bull Run battlefield, and get this developer, his name was Till Hazel, out of there. Once we did that, though, we began to think, well, what else out here in the way of Civil War battlefields are under threat? So we established a commission that was made up of a number of the good historians whose names you all would recognize. Ed was the staff director. I was on the commission, and we began to travel. Well, we'd hear briefings from Ed, and then we'd travel around and we'd see where these battlefields were and what the threat was to their demolition. The other interesting thing regards the National Park Service itself. And there are a number of these battlefields that are within the jurisdiction or within the boundary of a National Park Service unit. But what happens is that when the national parks are, and this applies to Yellowstone and Yosemite and all of the units of the national park system, the national parks initially get an authorization from the authorizing committee to establish a battlefield or establish a new national park out in the west, take Yosemite as an example, although it's been around a long time. But the authorizing committees authorize the National Park Service to acquire land within this boundary. Now, they can only acquire it within the boundary that is identified on a map. And the boundary is not just, straight around. It goes all around different directions. But the problem is the authorizing committee has no authority to appropriate any money for the Park Service to acquire anything within the boundary. They're just authorized to acquire it. So they then have to go to the Appropriations Committee and get appropriated funds to start acquiring what they are authorized within this boundary to acquire. And that is a never-ending process. And if you look at battlefields like Yellowstone, or Gettysburg, or you look at Yellowstone or other just national parks, they have inholdings within all of these units. And the inholdings are owned by, individuals who can buy and sell and do whatever they want to because they own it. And until the Park Service gets money to acquire that land, those inholdings are still there. And there was a situation at Gettysburg not too long ago where there was going to be a major development right behind Little Round Top by a family that owned that property. And eventually, now you can get some money from private funds. Pew Charitable Trust, for example, can acquire something within the boundary and then give it to the Park Service. And that's happened in a number of cases. Some of these nonprofits that are out helping preserve battlefields, Conservation Fund is another one, and they will acquire some of these inholdings in these key areas and then give the inholding, once they acquire it, to the Park Service. So there are all kinds of threats out, even within the boundary of the existing national battlefields. Gettysburg, Antietam, Sharpsburg, well, the Confederates call it Sharpsburg, but there are inholdings within all of these units of the Park Service. So when we got this Till Hazel and that one straightened out and preserved, then went around and tried to see what the status was with this commission that we set up as to the other battlefields. And there's a big study. I've got the study. I didn't bring it because if people want a copy of it, I can get you a copy of the study. But it's a study went state by state, all of the Civil War battles within various states, and where, the graphs of what the private ownership was and what had been preserved. So there's a pretty good history of that. There are a number of, one of the things that we did was establish this, as Trem was saying, the Civil War Trust, and we got some federal money that was appropriated to sell Civil War coins, and the Civil War Trust was a federal organization that actually did very well in selling the Civil War coins to raise funds to acquire lands and preserve battlefield grounds. Eventually, however, they ran out of money, and so this Civil War Preservation Trust, which you have the hallowed ground and material on, is a result of a combination of the Civil War Trust merging with the overall sort of national private Civil War preservation organization called Association for Preservation of Civil War Sites. So that organization and the Civil War Trust formed the Preservation for Civil War Sites, which is doing very well, and they're raising funds, and they're getting funds from a lot of the nonprofit organizations that are interested in preserving the battlefields and so on. Another way to look at this, and I know that, I'm happy to answer questions, so I don't want to spend a lot of time here, because I want you to ask questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. But I think people say, well, why should we worry about trying to preserve the Civil War battlefields? I mean, we have the Revolutionary War battlefields, and there are a lot of Civil War battlefields and other things that we should be preserving. I think if I could be sort of as succinct as possible in why I think it's important to preserve Civil War battlefields. I think after we won our war with Britain and freed ourselves from British rule, we were a series of states. And I think leading up to the Civil War, the South, the Virginians, Lee, was not about to fight his native state. They were Virginians, and they weren't about to fight to their land and their homes and their country. And that was the same with Longstreet and all of the Confederates. They were very state-oriented. And they were not going to fight against their state because that was what they believed in. On the other side, I think from the federal side, we weren't, and I say we because, I'm a Northerner, we weren't so state-oriented. We saw, I think, things in the bigger picture than just states' rights or fighting for Virginia or fighting for Tennessee or fighting for Georgia. And I think that this comes to sort of, at least in my mind, sort of comes to the forefront when Lincoln was in Gettysburg and he gave his less than 2-minute remarks. In those 2 minutes, he mentioned nation 5 times, and he didn't mention union at all. And to me, that is very significant because he saw what was happening on those battlefields. We weren't a bunch of people trying to bring states back into a union anymore. He was seeing what we were doing on those battlefields as creating a nation. When you get to the end, to Appomattox, and Grant, receives the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the next morning, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who held down the left flank of Little Round Top, and was by that time a major general. And Grant ordered General Chamberlain to receive the army, the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. So at first light, Chamberlain got out on the Appomattox Road and he lined up the federal First Corps. And they stood there with their muskets, in front of them, sort of at parade rest. And the Confederates were brought up by General John B. Gordon, led by what was left of the old Stonewall Brigade. And they were dragging their muskets, and they were starving, and they were beaten, and you can imagine how they came up. Well, when General Gordon got abreast of General Chamberlain, Chamberlain ordered his bugler to blow the Army of the Potomac into carry arms. And carry arms is the marching salute with muskets. And when Gordon heard that, he reared his horse, tipped his saber, and ordered the Army of Northern Virginia into carry arms. And at that point, the Army of Northern Virginia straightened up, brought their arms up to the carry position, made a left turn, and faced the Union troops in the carry position. And I think at that point in our history, with those two armies facing each other on the Appomattox Road, we became a nation. And the Confederates stacked their muskets, unslung their cartridge pellets, and went home. Now, it all happened on those battlefields. That's where it happened. And that's what created this nation. And that's why I think it's important that they be preserved. Now, I'll be glad to answer questions, and I want to have Roy Budd come up. He promised me he'd come up at this point if I ask him to. So, Roy? Roy is a direct descendant of the highest Confederate general killed in the war, A.P. Hill. And he was killed at Five Forks toward the very end of the war. And I just told Roy, I had two great uncles in the 6th Ohio Cavalry that were at Five Forks. But it was a infantryman that shot A.P. Hill, not Union cavalry.
That's right.
So Roy,
I told Frank earlier that I liked his uniform, but it was the wrong color. But I think Frank is kind of underselling himself to you. I had the opportunity to attend the
when
Civil
you're
War.
done, I've got a little. Let me just finish my story, quick, real quick. A.P. Hill always, when he went into battle, wore a red shirt. That was his trademark, a red shirt. So Roy, from the same organization that made my uniform, here is an authentic red shirt that A.P. Hill would have been wearing.
Thank you very much. Frank and I had the opportunity to attend the annual conference of the Civil War Preservation Trust Fund last year in Sharpsburg, Maryland, not Antietam.
That was Antietam Creek, so that's why the Union called it Antietam.
It was Sharpsburg. But at that conference was my first opportunity to be with Frank, and there was about 400 people in attendance, major historians from around the country in terms of Civil War. James McPherson and Bud Robertson and a number of others that were there, and they all knew Frank personally. And I could overhear some of the conversations some of the folks were having about Frank's leadership. At one point, after Frank became the Deputy Secretary of Interior and was instrumental in getting the coinage printed so they could sell it and raise revenue for the preservation of the battlefields. After he left the Department of Interior, what he didn't tell you tonight was that he provided the leadership to take the two splintered groups that he described to you and pull them together into one comprehensive unit. And that in itself was the beginning of the Civil War Preservation Trust Fund, and that's the result of his leadership. And I was quite proud to be with him at that event. As a result of that, a gentleman came up to me, O'Neill, and introduced himself to me, and his name really didn't resonate with me, and he apologized to me. And I couldn't believe, why would you be apologizing to me? I've never met you before. And he was apologizing because the infantry guard that was guarding A.P. Hill doing that ride from Petersburg down through to Five Forks. Hill was not killed at Five Forks. He was killed at Boydton Plank Road, just south of Petersburg, was attached to the 5th Alabama Cavalry. They were his direct descendants. So he was apologizing to me for his direct descendants, for his ancestors not doing a better job of guarding A.P. Hill. And that gentleman, his name was Paul Bryant, Jr., the son of Bear Bryant from the University of Alabama, who's now chairman of the Board of Trustees for the University of Alabama. So those are the type of people that participate in the Civil War Preservation Trust Fund. And again, that organization really can trace its roots to the leadership of Frank Bracken. So it's a real pleasure to be in the midst of Frank Bracken in those type of environments. So thank you very much. Ed Bars, you may know Ed, since you're an historian as well, but is probably the greatest battlefield interpreter I've ever been associated with, and he can just bring a battlefield to life for you. And Frank and I had the opportunity to be on the Sharpsburg battlefield last year with him, and he was describing how A.P. Hill came up on the last day of the battle wearing his red hunter's shirt and saved the day for the South at that particular point in time, which many people felt was the real high watermark of the battle of the Civil War, was at the Battle of Antietam or the Battle of Sharpsburg. After that, things began to go downhill pretty quickly for the South. But again, it's materials and literature that Frank has provided to you. Right on the front cover there, we're talking about the Battle of Glendale, which is really the Battle of Frazier's Farm, Frank. and how they're trying to raise money to save that battlefield at this current time. That was probably the turning point of the war. At that particular battle, James Longstreet and A.P. Hill were able to forge and break through the Union line at that particular point in time and had routed the Union Army. And if they'd have continued to press the issue that particular day, the war may have ended a different way. So that's how important this piece of ground is in terms of saving for the history of our country. So I applaud the efforts of the Civil War Preservation Trust Fund, and I certainly am proud to be associated with Frank Bracken. Thank you very much, Frank.
I'll get it to you. Don't worry, Roy. I'm not wearing A.P. Hill's red shirt. Well, thank you. Yeah, Roy and I had a great time on the battlefield. Ed Bars is he's just terrific. I mean, you can't imagine what a super guy Ed Bars is. Well, I'd be happy to answer any questions or anybody has. We had, on my side of the family, we did have one Confederate who was in Loudoun County Artillery, who was in Longstreet's Corps, was at Gettysburg, and other than that, all we had were on the Union side. We had a woman, though, which I think is interesting. She was Mary Ball, and then she married a guy named Bickerdike, so she went by Mary Bickerdike. They called her Mother Bickerdike. Bickerdike's wife died and had little kids, so she felt sorry for him. But she was with Sherman's army all the way down through Georgia and attended to the wounded and did all these things. And when they had the Grand Review in Washington, the Army of the Potomac went down first, and then Sherman's army went down the second day. And literally, this is a true story, the soldiers in Sherman's army voted for Mother Bickerdike to ride abreast of Sherman, going down Pennsylvania Avenue on the second day with Sherman's army behind them. So that's something that a woman did with a lot of gusto. I've got some pictures of her. Yeah.
That Frank is failing to tell you, I don't know why he went to tell you this. In the Battle of Corinth, Mississippi, Frank had a grandfather who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. And his name is, if you go to the State House here in Indianapolis, they have a list of all Hoosiers who won the Congressional Medal of Honor in that State House. Frank's grandfather's name's on that list.
Yeah, that's true. He did get the Congressional Medal of Honor at Corinth, Mississippi. Yeah, cool.
If you had to pick one or two battlefields that you think are the most endangered, which ones would you pick and why?
Boy, I don't know. I mean, that's tough. You know, one, as I was mentioning earlier, one of the dangers are the inholdings in battlefields like Gettysburg or Shiloh or those battles. I mean, they're pretty well preserved, but you've still got inholdings in there that need to be acquired. There is a list in that hallowed ground, and they have listed in there what they think, and I would agree, are the most endangered battlefields. And I guess all I could do would be to look at that and list the ones that, at least at this point, they feel are the most endangered. A lot of it, of course, is how close are the developers, and how quick is something like this going to happen there. A lot of the little battlefields, I mean, you take Brandy Station. I don't know how many people, and I'm not going to ask for a vote, but how many people have ever heard of Brandy Station? Okay. Brandy Station was a battle that occurred on June 8, 1863. And it was after Fredericksburg, after Chancellorsville, and those were Confederate victories, even though Jackson was killed at Chancellorsville. And Stuart had just kind of put on a cavalry display for Lee's army. He camped that night on the Rappahannock River at a place called Brandy Station. And at first light the next morning, John Buford, who was the cavalry captain up at Gettysburg when the Confederates were coming down holding the line, John Buford came slamming across the Rappahannock River and knocked Stuart completely off the field. Just, he was still in the bedrolls and everything, just blew him completely off the field. Probably didn't last more than 3 hours. Union cavalry went back across the Rappahannock, went to Gettysburg. Stuart, if you look at his route, I mean, he went north, he looped around, he went north of Washington, he went all the way up toward Maryland, he got north, he finally came down to Gettysburg on the second day. Lee had no idea what he was running into when he was going north and ended up coming down the Cashtown Road to Gettysburg. He had no idea that the whole Union Army was coming up there, because Stuart never got to him until the second night. Now that happened at Brandy Station. And who's ever heard of Brandy Station? But just think of what might have been the outcome at Gettysburg if Brandy Station hadn't happened. Now that battlefield is one that is, there are a lot of locals there, and they're working on trying to get that preserved. If you've seen the battle, well, you probably have seen the movie, The Battle of Gettysburg. I've been at Brandy Station with Sam Elliott in his John Buford uniform, and boy, that's enough to give you shivers. Because I think that Sam Elliott's terrific. He was terrific as John Buford at Gettysburg. Any other?
The unit that was in Corinth, that Mississippi, was it?
Corinth, Mississippi? Yeah.
Yes. Was that a unit that came from Ohio or Indiana?
Now, who are you talking about? The one that won the Congressional Medal of Honor?
Yes.
He came from Spencer, Indiana. And he married a gal named Lizzie. And anyway, I won't get into this, but Lizzie's father didn't think this guy was good enough for her. His name was Will Archer. And so he got his daughter Lizzie to leave Spencer. So I've got a letter that Will Archer wrote Lizzie saying, it's no fun being here in Spencer anymore, and your father doesn't think I'm good enough for you, so I'm leaving Spencer, you know, on and on and on. I mean, it's really something. So he wins the Congressional Medal of Honor at Corinth. And what he did, he was commander of the 50, I got to remember this. He was commander of, there were two Indiana units at Corinth, 57th and 59th. And he was commanding the 57th, and all of the officers went down in the 59th. They were all just dead. And he ran over and took over the 59th and appointed another guy to take the 57th on. And he led the 59th in a charge that turned out to be very successful and saved the battle at Corinth. He did marry Lizzie, or I wouldn't be here talking to you. Came from my grandmother Bracken's side of the family.
Are these the pictures, Frank, that I'm showing up here?
Yeah, those pictures are my great-grandfather Bracken. He's smaller than me, even if his uniform had survived. He's provost marshal there. That's a provost marshal guard at Tennessee. And then another picture will come up, and that's him later in life. My grandfather, Bracken, was his son. They had another wedding, Vaughn. His wife lived a lot longer than he did.
to take us through perhaps 2 or 3 pieces of the memorabilia that you brought here and describe them to us?
You mean tell you about these things?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, sure. All of the material is I had made. I mean, there's some good, what they call sutlers, that make, uniforms for reenactors and, movie people and so on. And they do a very good job. I mean, they're all authentic. And you can see that this gray coat, I mean, they're heavier than the devil. They obviously didn't have summer or winter uniforms. But these things were all exactly the way they were made during the war. This is his saber. I mean, this is his original. It's got his name on it. So that saber is original. His name William Ellsworth Bracken, right? This is an original that actually he got in a surrender. Oh yeah, you can. Yeah, this is an original sword. This is an infantry sword, and he got that in a surrender toward the end of the war by Confederates.
You should take it back outside.
But this one, that's a cavalry saber, and that's original. And his name is William Ellsworth Bracken, right there. This pistol is his original pistol. See it?
How did you load it?
Well, this is the loading lever right here. You cock it, and the loading lever would put the powder in here. I mean, it was in kind of a little piece of linen, sort of real thin, with powder. You put it in here like that, and then you did 6 shots, and then you put a cap here, so that when you pulled the trigger, it would push the spark through the hole into the powder, and so you had it was a 6 shot. The pistol holsters are original. I got these are 2 reproductions. Such they're pretty much the same, except they're got sort of lighter wood. But this one goes over the
Caliber of the, yeah.
caliber. The type of bullet, like a 44. Yeah, caliber probably. Yeah, probably. I'll have to look at it because they're rifles. It's a big bore, so they come out of there. Yeah, they come out of there spinning. But these are. This goes over the front of the horse, in front of your saddle. So the leather is original. It did originally have a cover that went over here, and you can see it's neck here, and then it went under the horse's neck, and had a kind of a belt, with a buckle, so that if you were going fast, it, hit a bump or something, it didn't fly up and get away from you, out there. But this is an original watch of his, although he got it after the war. It was actually given to him by the Internal Revenue Service. He was a lawyer down there, so I got a third degree. But it's got the engraving down here. It's presented to William H. Bracken by the Internal Revenue officers of the 6th District, Indiana. 1875. November 18th. No, wait a minute, that's not, it's 90. I didn't bring my glasses because I knew they didn't go with the uniform.
I'll take mine off. 1897.
1897.
Yeah, just.
Are there many discrepancies between official and non-official accounts of these events?
I'd say yes. Depends on who wrote them. You know, yeah, I would say that if you go back and, you know, read some of the old things that were written after some of these battles, obviously, you know, from the south side or the north side, they're going to be discrepancies.
Who do you consider the best historians today? McPherson?
Yeah, McPherson. He was on our commission, and I know him. Judy knows him. I mean, he's just a super guy. He wrote it. He read that Team of Rivals. He wrote a very terrific review of that book when it first came out, which was excellent. He was at the annual meeting last year with Roy and me. Okay, John?
Go to Gettysburg, what are some of the best or battlefields to visit?
Well, Antietam's pretty well. That's been pretty well preserved, and so you can see that battlefield pretty well. Shiloh's pretty, you know, it's pretty good. It's got most of Shiloh is still there. I mean, to see that. Petersburg. Yeah. Petersburg. Randy Station's still there. There's a local group that has done a great job preserving Randy Station and the developers with Cameron Williams. But that is I mean, it's a small battlefield, but it was key, and their local group has done a good job.
It looks as if historically the fighting was much more close in terms of the two armies engaging than it is anywhere near today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, no question about that than today. But the other thing that made it so deadly was that that during the Civil War, they were still using Revolutionary War tactics. I mean, they were just coming at you straight on, but by the time the Civil War came, I mean, well, okay, the Revolutionary War took you 3 minutes to reload. It was a round ball, came rattling out of there and go maybe about 100, 200 yards, not too accurate. So, you know, the chances of you getting hit with one of those was, well, at least if you did get hit on the first shot, you were armed with your bayonet before he could reload. Civil War, they had rifle barrels. They could reload and fire 3 rounds a minute, and they'd go accurate, a quarter of a mile. And then they had shrapnel, you know, in those big smooth bores, and they had rifle artillery, exploding shells. I mean, there's no way. I mean, you look at Gettysburg and you look at the third day when they tried to charge, there was no way they were going to get into the Union lines. I mean, once they got between here and that wall, you were getting hit with shrapnel. This huge, like shotguns. One guy got through and they were Armistead, and he died right there.
It sounds more like a massacre than a fight.
Yeah.
Frank, how did people get into the Army in those days? You hear about a high percentage of young people who were in the Army, both armies. How did they get there? There wasn't a draft in those days. Were they recruited through their locality?
Yeah,
How did your uncle?
Yeah, there wasn't a draft. They came from localities. I mean, they would come from different, towns and areas.
Was each town given a quota?
That's what I know. I don't know. Oh, do you know? You probably know
There
better.
was a draft actually, early in the war, when volunteered, the Confederates started the draft in 62 and the Union 63, when the volunteering dipped. But the main purpose of the draft actually was to stimulate volunteering, because drafting, being a conscript, was sort of ignoble. The early part of the year, they had all these young men pouring out because they thought the war would be over quickly. Didn't realize how long the war was going to be. That first flush of volunteering then gave way in that draft.
We have some of the letters that are now up online that are in the archives here. One young man talks about whether or not he should stay in his home township because there are a certain number of men that have to be called up, and if he goes home, he's going to end up in the Army. Or this is a discussion among young men that he knows, whether they want to go home and, get conscripted or whatever, or whether maybe he'll stay in Ohio a little longer. So there was that going on too.
Yeah, the national government did set quotas for the states in terms of drafting, and they had to produce so many people. And the locales, what they did to recruit was offer bounties. So, for example, you mentioned Spencer. I've seen a letter where one young man is from Putnam County, but he's got to go to Spencer, Owen County, because their bounty for joining the service was higher there. The inducement was greater.
Both sides also allowed men to hire substitutes, which is where the rich man's battle, poor man's fight idea comes from. And there was, I know there were people in Lincoln's administration who were criticized because they hired substitutes, and later on, too, that became on the women's rights activism stuff. The women got mad about that nasty little amendment, not including them, and they pointed out who had hired substitutes during the war.
Who did it?
Well, some of them.
Teddy Roosevelt's father hired a substitute.
Well, didn't Stanton and some of Lincoln's cabinets? People in the
I don't know about
Congress.
that.
I don't remember, but the women's rights activists who were demanding the vote, and he didn't get the vote after the war, I think it's like, then began to, part of the argument for not getting the vote was that women didn't fight, so why should they vote? And the women's response was to point out the men in government who had hired substitutes during the war.
Was that a legitimate thing to do?
Yes, there were ads in newspapers, wanted, substitute for $300. Yeah. Both North and South, there were advertised in newspapers.
Are there any more questions for Frank? Or?
Well, I want to thank you very much, and we just have a little token here for you. Here's your official Friends pin also for you, and another little token to help you get a few more Civil War items. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed it very much. I have a good time. Next year.